Welcome to the Journey of an Aesthete podcast, a comprehensive examination of all things aesthetic, the arts, the humanities, and what it means to be human. Welcome to Journey of an Aesthete. That
little bit of music that you just heard was the very first music that I've composed since, I would say, I began it in earnest in April. And I am recording this solo episode on May 8th in 2020. And that music is going to be a long piece of music. It's a big piece with many sections. I think there's going to be 4 movements, and it might run to 30 minutes, and it's not all like that. I mean, it's just fast music, and it gets down, and it boogies in places, and it's called All Dressed Up and No Place to Go is what I'm calling it. And it's, I call it, subtitle is a modular memoir, because it's a musical modular memoir, because it's modular, and that the different movements or sections, I think, can be moved around slightly. In any event, that's that. I hope you got something out of it. In preparing for this, our second solo episode of just me talking, I went back and listened to the very first solo episode, which, as it happens, was our first podcast episode, July 1st of 2019. I listened to it again in preparation for this one, and I read some kind of serious philosophy, right? I read from Isaiah Berlin and talked about pluralism, and it was I'm still a pluralist. I've been a pluralist for as long as I've been a thinking person, and I wanted to give as they say these days, a shout out to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, which for me is one of the greatest things on the entire internet. And I wanted to mention them because they have every subject, the highest scholarly level. If you just come up with any old word, you could say freedom, you could say justice, or you could say religion, or or pluralism. So the phrase "value pluralism," if you type that in, you will get a very good entry, and it'll mention some really interesting people like Bernard Williams, whom I was also a big fan, and I won't belabor the point there, but in general, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy is a real, as I say, treasure trove or treasure chest. I thought that this episode I would read some different selections. I compiled about 4, and I love to start with a poem. And the poem I chose is One Art by Elizabeth Bishop. She wrote this in 1976, and it was a poem that I've always loved. It's one of my favorite poems of the 20th century. And I had the occasion to read this at my father's funeral. And I'm just going to recite the poem now. I'm going to read it, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about it afterwards. Not too much, because I want the spell or spirit of it to last some time. So here it goes. One Art by Elizabeth Bishop. The art of losing isn't hard to master. So many things seem filled with the intent to be lost that their loss is no disaster. Lose something every day, accept the fluster of lost car door keys, the hour badly spent. The art of losing isn't hard to master. Then practice losing farther, losing faster, places and names, and where it was you meant to travel. None of these will bring disaster. I lost my mother's watch, and look, my last or next to last of 3 loved homes went. The art of losing isn't hard to master. I lost 2 cities, lovely ones, and vaster. Some realms I owned, 2 rivers, a continent. I miss them, but it wasn't a disaster. Even losing you, the joking voice, a gesture I love, I shouldn't have lied. It's evident. The art of losing's not too hard to master, though it may look like. Write it. Like disaster. So that's that poem. When she says write it, it's in parentheses, exclamation point. It's almost like a note to self. You have to write it. I really feel this poem. I had a really once in a lifetime, one of a kind opportunity to talk to Helen Vendler about this poem, and it was outside of Harvard University. I should say I was not a student of hers. It was I just recognized her actually because we were in the same coffee place in Harvard Square, and I got up the courage to approach her and ask her about this poem, and we talked about it for a little bit, and I'm not going to rehearse here all that was mentioned in that conversation, except to say that I sort of feel like there's two approaches to the poem that don't seem quite right. One is to emphasize the unreliability of the narrator, and to say that they have self-deception, and that they're not mastering anything, and it's they're just saying they're going to master it, and it's to emphasize how underneath that it's a deeply despairing poem, in other words, because she's not mastering anything. That's not quite right. On the other hand, to say that it's a poem about triumph over adversity, or that it's about how loss doesn't really exist, and to look at it in a purely optimistic way or a purely loss denying way, that's not right either. I take this poem to be actually kind of in the spirit of our entire podcast, because it's about consciousness and about art making in a way. In that I take it that consciousness is the subject of all art. And that brings me to 2020 in the month of May. And I think that any time any human being has made a book or a movie or a TV show or a poem or a sculpture or a song or anything that humans make, that at least in part it's always valid or has validity eternally. Now, there were better and worse moments for a particular work of art. I chose this poem because I feel it speaks to now at this time in some respects. But on the other hand, I think this poem is forever, and I think that someone could have written something this morning, and that has as much validity as something written 1,000 years ago. And I do stand by that, and it's in that spirit. That, and of course pluralism, because I mentioned pluralism in the first episode, and that we come here as plural beings, and it isn't so much that pluralism is the best policy, but that it's sort of the reality principle that each of us comes here as an introvert or an extrovert, or a partier or a recluse, or someone that wants to hear rock music and go into a mosh pit, or somebody wants to hear a guitar recital in a library, and who knows, there's so many possibilities. And I'd like to think that something of all of that can be expressed in this podcast. While we're on the subject of plurality and plural beings and art making and all the rest of this podcast is about, I wanted to read from Suzuki Roshi. And this is from his talks at the Zen Center he, I think, created in the 60s and early 70s in San Francisco. And it's Shunryu Suzuki. And I was introduced to this talk as a 13-year-old, 13 or 14. A friend of the family had studied this particular practice. And he said, "Hey, Mitch, have a look at this, Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind." And I'm going to read you a passage here that I think is so beautiful. I have to find it first, of course. It's supposed to be professional and have all this stuff earmarked and planned before the show, but I can talk and I can sort of and here we have it. It's from a section entitled Posture. He says, "After some years we will die. If we just think that this is the end of our life, this will be the wrong understanding. But, on the other hand, if we think that we do not die, this is also wrong. We die and we do not die. This is the right understanding. Some people may say that our mind or soul exists forever, and it is only our physical body which dies. But that is not exactly right, because both mind and body have their end. But at the same time, it is also true that they exist eternally. And even though we say mind and body, they are actually two sides of one coin. This is the right understanding. So when we take this posture, it symbolizes the truth. When I have the left foot on the right side of my body and the right foot on the left side of my body, I do not know which is which. So either may be left or the right side. I encountered that at the age of 14, and I feel that reading that and thinking about it and actually meditating upon it for... I'm 52 now. Up until now, has been... it's just been... I don't know what to say. It seems right to me what he says, and that's how I regard matters of life and death, and that's how I regard art too. And it's hard to summarize or explain, but we do have his words, and we can. There's a lot there if we were so interested. I have two more selections to read on this solo episode, and before I read them, I want to thank, first of all the new listeners. I want to say welcome if you're brand new and you haven't listened to this podcast before. Thank you for joining us on this journey. As you know, when I started this podcast back in July, 1st of July of 2019, I had gone on a journey, physical, geographical journey myself. After living 30 years in the East Coast, Boston, Massachusetts, New York City, Manhattan, I found myself in very different geography in a rural town in North Carolina, which is where I am now. It's where I'm recording this episode. So I say to you, if you're a return audience, a returning listener, welcome back. And I'm glad you've been on this journey with me. I want to express immediate gratitude not only, of course, to listeners and audiences, but to the guests, all the guests I've had. Every single guest I've had on this show, 10, 11, 12 episodes, however many we've had, every single one of them, I really wanted to hear what they had to say, and I was really filled with gratitude that they took the time out of their lives, which were often very busy, not just with art making, but mainly with art making, but all sorts of other life's, what life is full of, and that they took time out of their life to come on my show and talk about, from their heart, from their soul, talk about what it is they do when they make something. I really felt when I started this podcast, not only did I feel that there wasn't enough, pluralism. I thought that it was sort of one size fits all, a lot of things out there. And but I also wanted to hear the artist speak. I wanted to hear the voice of the artist. I wanted them to be able to come on my show, turn the microphone on, and have them say something about their journey and how they came to the place where they created the thing they created. No matter what it was, TV or high budget, low budget, a team in a room, one person with a quill or at a computer screen or a pen, doesn't matter. It's all good, and it's all welcome here on Journey of an Aesthete. I didn't know quite how many selections to read. I have a number of things. I wanted to read something by Michael Andre Bernstein. He wrote a book in 1996 that I still have on my shelf. The title is Foregone Conclusions Against Apocalyptic History. And I really liked that. And I got out this book at this time, of course, right, with a title like that, to read Bernstein's remarks against apocalyptic history, or I guess he was writing this to write against the grain of apocalyptic thinking. And he died very young, but he was a wonderful critic. He was a scholar of the Holocaust, or as he preferred to call it, this is very important to him, the Shoah. And he wrote about, of course, so many writers. He was a genius. He's one of those guys who was just a genius and a polymath and knew about so much. And he wrote about literature and art and, of course, reality and war and all the rest of it. And there's a passage in this book where he's being very much the contrarian in spirit. He's saying, we're so habitually used to thinking about things in terms of crude determinism, or in terms of inevitability, or things being pre-planned or preordained, and he's having none of it. He's just read one passage. He says, "The sad truth is this: in contrast to the celebrated opening of Tolstoy's Anna Karenina, it is unhappy consciousnesses that are so much resemble one another in their misery, while happiness is always singular and hard won. More challengingly, though, and against much of the writing done today on the Shoah, from both religious and philosophical perspectives, I believe that very little about human nature or values can be learned from a situation in extremis, except the virtual tautology that extreme pressure brings out extreme and extremely diverse behavior. Beliefs, ideas, values, and people are tested best in the daily, routine actions and habits of normal life, not in moments of extraordinary crisis. And because foreshadowing can only point to a single inherently dramatic, rather than typical and quotidian, resolution, it must privilege the uniquely climactic over the normative and repeatable. To reject the validating force of extreme crises involves both formal and ethical decisions, precisely because such a rejection, based as it is on a moral stance, necessitates finding a new form of writing in order to articulate its new understanding. And only a prosaics of side-shadowing, I think, can do justice to the richness, both humanly and philosophically, of the claims of the ordinary. I won't go on, but he has this concept in the book that he calls side-shadowing, that he wants to counterpose as an alternative to foreshadowing. I I really got deeply into this book, and I don't really want to, on this, it would be really not the wisest thing to go too deep into it, because that's the book, and he's the scholar he was. But what I take from that is this love of the ordinary, and this idea. I like that very much idea that we're, especially now, people are always saying, talking about being tested and talking about what somebody's made of and all this, and also talking about what books and movies are right or wrong for a particular time. And I just think it's important to understand that, the things people make and the things that people feel in their consciousness is usually, I think there's always some validity to it. And it's up to us whether we want to honor that and whether we want to fall into, I think, a trap of seeing history, seeing our life only in this melodramatic way. And I think the quotidian, and I think arts, even arts. Look, arts that are epic about great wars, without exception, they always interrogate the drama. In other words, they always in the end, I think, has something to say about the ordinary, and come back to what I would call the ordinary. They come back to the human in various different ways, and I think that's a truth. And this podcast, Journey of an Aesthete, we are, I hope, on this podcast affirming the ordinary and quotidian, and we're not saying that there aren't extraordinary things, and we're not saying that, of course, a great hero may rise to the occasion, right, and may deliver some kind of goodness in a time of in a great trial, but that's not all, and that's not all. It's not all. The only right thing is to only think in these ways. In any event, I've said too much about that. I wanted to end on a humorous note, of course, because this is a podcast of the arts, and the arts involve comedy. And I want to read from Frank Lesser's letter to William Schumann on the occasion of the birth of the Lincoln Center for the Performing Arts. And after station identification, I will return and we will conclude with that letter. Everybody needs an anchor in life. You, me, just everybody. Anchor made this whole show possible. I'm immensely grateful to them. You too can use Anchor to make your own shows and create your own vision. Download the Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started. Thank you. And we are back at Journey of an Aesthete after station identification. And our sponsors, mention our sponsors. I should like to conclude on a lighter note, change your register, and read part of this letter that the one and only Frank Lesser, composer of Guys and Dolls, How to Succeed in Business Without Really Trying, many wonderful songs, letter he wrote to William Schumann, the composer, in 1972 on the occasion of Lincoln Center for the Performing Arts being a new thing in New York City. And here's what Mr. Lesser had to say. Dear Billy, answering yours of August 13th, I did not accuse you, but merely remarked on your guise as a statesman. You supplied the word stuffed shirt. I don't particularly take pride in not having been at Lincoln Center. I simply am reporting on the fact that I know very little about it, but that as far as I was impressed the wrong way chemically. Anyway, I have read your literature you so kindly included. When we meet in the fall, I will have made it a point to have visited Lincoln Center. I'm sure I will have seen nothing evil in it, any more than I do in the typeface and in your giant brochure. But I still want some definitions from you. For instance, these words: artistic, development, encouraging, education, etc., etc. And another definition I will want from you is of the performing arts. It seems that your prospectus does not include a few of the performing arts. For instance, where is professional wrestling, bullfighting, auto races, burlesque comedy, radio and TV announcing, news and weather reporting, political debate, religious oratory, figure skating, striptease, diving, auctioneering, stilt walking, juggling, restaurant greeting and seating, marching and drilling exhibition, etc., etc., etc. Please, Billy, don't suppose that I am pushing for a more vulgarian tendency in your program there. I am pushing for nothing but simply pointing out that the performing arts are not necessarily the nifty performing arts or the divine performing arts or the accredited performing arts. Let me submit that Hemingway, a high-class fellow, found something noble in bullfighting, that Fred Allen, the much-esteemed wit, started as a juggler, that Victor Moore, who gave such a sensitive performance as Gramps in Borrowed Time, learned his craft in burlesque, that Billy Graham is more effective as an actor than Sir Laurence Olivier, that the Indianapolis Speedway has a bigger and more avid audience in one than do the combined performances of La Tosca in the country over a 10-year period, even though both audiences are there receiving the smell of imminent death, that there is an abiding thrill for millions in the performances of those boys marching across the field at West Point, and that skywriting, parachute jumping, and fireworks, all performing arts, make one look up and awe and wonder. But what I have just reported, I don't mean as corrective criticism, mind you. It happens that I myself prefer ballet, drama, opera, and musical comedy, and not too many other kinds of performances. I am not proposing that you include Billy Graham or, I'm dating myself a little here, Manolette in your program. A sneaky thought reminds me that I should indeed like fireworks emanating from your real estate, but skip it until you're run short of plays. Well, I don't think Mr. Frank Lesser needs to be taken literally as every example at his word, although if anyone out there listening to this do any of those activities he mentioned, whether it's stilt walking or juggling or any of the rest of it on his list, I'd love to have you on the show to talk about your own experience in your own words, from your own point of view and no one else's. And you too can be a guest on Jody of An Aesthete. I should like to say that I hate saying goodbye. Every episode I do, I have to say goodbye eventually, because all things come to an end, good or otherwise. And I've really enjoyed, most of all, having the artists on my show, the guests on my show, be able to say in their own words what it is they're doing when they actually make something. And I've been thankful that each and every one of them has taken the time. Time is precious, right? Taken time out of their schedule, spent some time on this show, and to enlighten people as to what it is that they do. And as I am the host, you could tell I'm putting off saying goodbye, of course, but I will say goodbye, and hopefully we will meet again sooner rather than later, and thank you.